I think, as Ambassador Gross said, the last panel teed up this one really well, which is on data and trade. And I know it's the last panel of the conference and the last panel of the day, and I can't believe nobody else has pointed this out, but there's actually a lightsaber up here. So if anyone else tries to leave, they're going to have to go through that. Now, it used to be the case that trade was almost purely goods many eons ago, and there were things made one place and shipped to another. We had a pretty good idea of what it meant and how to measure its role in the economy, which was large. But as our economy became increasingly services-oriented, so too did our trade. And trade and services became harder to measure and harder to negotiate, but no less important. And now a growing part of trade and services and trade overall is digital trade, which is even harder to fit into our typical view of trade and trade policy. But it affects and is important to some of the fastest growing parts of our economy and probably most of the companies that are represented here. And we haven't considered in detail what that means, but that's what we're going to do here. And I think we've got all the right people to do this, the people who study it, negotiate it, and have to live it. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, but they are actually sitting in strategic order. So I'll introduce them each quickly. We have Meredith Broadbent, who is the chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission. She was sworn in as commissioner in September of 2012 and named chairman in June of 2014. Before joining the commission, Chairman Broadbent held the William M. Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and previously she served as Assistant U.S. What was it? Assistant U.S.
Trade Representative.
Assistant U.S. Trade Representative, right. I cut that off in my notes. The full bios are in the programs, of course. Then we have Mike Bandel, who is the Chief Economic Strategist at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, where he supervises PPI's research and policy work across a wide range of topics, including the data-driven economy, impact of regulation on innovation, and policies to improve production, investment, and job growth. And he's currently co-principal investigator for a Sloan Foundation grant on measuring the impact of globalization. Then we have Joshua Meltzer, who I'm actually not going in alphabetical order. I appear to be going in random order too. He was a fellow in global economy and development at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. His work focuses on international trade law and policy issues relating to the World Trade Organization and free trade agreements, the intersection between climate change and international trade, and the role of trade policy in supporting access to the internet and cross-border data flows. And we have Anupam Chander, who is the director of the California International Law Center, Martin Luther King Jr. Hall Research Scholar, and professor of law at the University of California, Davis, where his research focuses on the regulation of globalization and digitization. His most recent book, which I commend to you highly, The Electronic Silk Road, How the Web Binds the World Together in Commerce, was published by the Yale University Press, and he publishes widely in the nation's leading law journals. I think you just held that up, right? But I would recommend the Kindle edition. And then we have Matt Pearl, who is the head of policy development at Facebook, where he develops the company's positions on global policy issues. And before joining Facebook, he was counsel at the Congressional Oversight Panel. He previously worked on privatization policy as a consultant to the World Bank and served as a law clerk for the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Now, I want to start out at kind of a sort of a fundamental level. Meredith, maybe you could tell us sort of why is this issue important? Give us a sense of the magnitude and why is it worth our time?
Okay, thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. Just to tell you a little bit about my organization, the International Trade Commission, we're a little bit behind the scenes, but have been trying to contribute to some of the study and analysis of digital trade generally, provisions that are restricting digital trade or may potentially restrict it in the future, and also trying to quantify the impact on the U.S. economy of what digital trade means. The vehicle for that was a two-part study that was requested by the Senate Finance Committee about a year ago. The second part will be of that. The first part is entitled U.S. Trade in the Digital and Global Economies, U.S. ITC publication 4415. And I would recommend that to you if you're looking to think of this broadly as more of a national interest issue, what's out there for the U.S. economy generally. And then it will be followed up by a study which will be released September 11th, which we're excited about, which should answer some more questions that the Senate Finance Committee asked us. We're not policymakers, we're just analysts and collectors of data, and we try to give Congress and also the USTR supportive analytical work that will help them understand a broad context of kind of generally agreed facts with which they can make the policy decisions. And I think the policy decisions in this area will be really interesting soon, and I'm not sure when, but I think the trade agenda is starting to look more active, and I think maybe after the election, the Senate Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee will start looking very actively at a lot of the issues that you all have discussed in this really good conference. I think the role of legislation that's already been introduced, there's a bill by Senator Thune and Wyden, S788, the Digital Trade Act, I think is going to be very relevant. And there's similar provisions, similar themes in the CAMP, Baucus, Hatch, Trade Promotion Authority draft bill, which has about over 100 negotiating objectives, but several relate to digital trade issues that are facing U.S. companies like yourselves abroad in foreign markets where they're trying to be successful. So just to maybe put out a few factoids, and then I'll yield to my colleagues who have a lot of specific scholarship on some of these issues. U.S. cross-border trade and digitally enabled services totaled U.S. exports of $356 billion and U.S. imports of $221 billion. These are significant numbers for trade and the U.S. economy, and a very positive trade balance for the U.S. of $135 billion, which is noteworthy. We also have a lot of foreign investment. 67% of U.S. Global sales of majority-owned foreign affiliates of information technology companies go to Europe, so there's a big dominance of Europe in some of these bilateral relationships and frictions that are going on. But in general, the U.S. footprint in this area is huge. I mean, the U.S. is dominating the international economy right now, and I think it's something that policymakers will take into account if they do start legislating in the trade area. Our report actually focuses a bit on some of the big U.S. global companies. The big five we've pointed out are Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook, which my colleague will talk about, as well as Amazon. And these are total annual sales of these companies are very significant, and they're supported by other companies that provide the infrastructure for digital trade, such as IBM, HP, Dell, Cisco, Intel, and Oracle. So these are the big companies, and then there's a whole infrastructure, of course, of smaller, more innovative folks as well. It's a strong footprint and something that we're working to understand more, and we think it's an important part of the trade agenda, which is increasingly coming to terms with some of the issues that you all have been working on for many years: telecommunications policy and cybersecurity, privacy, and then intellectual property regulations. So there's a lot of overlapping policy concerns out there and a huge economic interest at stake, which we're excited to be involved in the negotiation of describing and analyzing for Congress and other stakeholders.
Thanks. So Mike, you've done a lot of work thinking about measurement issues and even what it means for what digital trade means with the bits flowing around the world. If you could tell us, what are some of the problems with measurement and why they matter, and then what we sort of mean when we talk about data flows. That would be useful.
Let me actually start with your second question first, which is
you could even start with something I didn't ask.
Why does measuring digital trade or cross-border data flows matter, and who does it matter to? It matters to both policymakers and to companies, and it matters not just in the area of trade policy, but in the area of tax policy too. When we think about the negotiation process on trade and tax policy, a lot of what we're doing is we have explicit and implicit trade-offs between different areas, different industries, goods, services, agriculture, data. And in some sense, in the back of our mind, we're putting greater weight on those areas and those industries that are contributing more to the economy, contributing more to trade. So in some sense, the measurement issue that we're asking is intrinsically connected to the policy issue. And it's intrinsically connected to the question about where are we leaning in terms of policy. And I'm going to make three observations here. One is our current system for measuring trade is about looking at monetary exchanges. That is to say, it's defined as a monetary exchange between two persons, where a person can be a corporation, of different nationalities. Observation one. Observation two, an enormous amount of cross-border data flow does not leave a monetary footprint. Now that's a function of the way the internet is currently set up. So if you think about peering, you can easily see how a piece of data can cross borders without any money actually ever changing hands. And this is a very, conceivably a very large amount, because one of the things that you mentioned, Meredith, was the big five. And when I think about cross-border data flows, so sometimes financial companies, London, New York, there's enormous amounts of data that's crossing borders there that is absolutely essential for enterprise, but not getting picked up in the trade statistics. And that's the third observation, is that if you have cross-border data flows that don't leave a monetary footprint, it's not going to be included in any of the trade statistics. And I have a paper to that effect where I sort of dug into the sub-basement of the data and made absolutely sure that was true. Now, there's a little bit of a historical aspect here, which is that if you go back to the industrial era, when we measured the economy, we actually counted things. We counted railroad carloads. We counted cans of corn. Then what happened is when we got into the era of services, we started, the statistical agencies now don't count anything real for the most part. What they do is they look at money flows and they adjust for prices. But I think we're going to have to start going back to looking at the actual flows of data to understand what's really happening here. And let me just give you a couple of numbers that these come from telegeography. They should be viewed as order of magnitude as opposed to completely, firm. But here's a couple of numbers. Peak international internet traffic is rising at 30 to 50% per year. The number for Africa is at the high end. The number for the US and Europe is at the low end, but still for US and Europe, it's on the order of 30% per year. Previous years have actually been higher. The growth of capacity is running at about 30% per year globally. This is international capacity. So it's all any capacity that's being added is being used. The price of transit, international internet transit, is falling. And so no matter what you think about what the base was, the contribution of cross-border data flows is potentially extremely large, okay, when you compare it to other types of trade. So let me just make a couple of points here and then finish up, okay? What that means is that the damage that could be done by bad trade policy could be much larger than we think. The damage that could be done by bad international tax policy could be larger than we think. I actually think that in the cross-border data flows has a lot more importance in some ways for tax policy than for trade policy because of the large amounts of money involved. But I leave you with one more thought, which is that the numbers that you cited there might actually be at the low end of the range for how economically important cross-border data flows are.
Let me just follow up with a question. So to put it in practical terms, the measurement issue, how we might, how we would think about it now and how you think we should think about it. So just as a hypothetical example, so say a small business in the US pays Facebook to advertise to people in Germany. So they're paying Facebook here probably. The data might be processed here or in another country, and somebody in Germany is looking at it. Would that fit into our trade statistics currently? And even if so or if not, should they, and how?
What I think is that we're going to have to think about a broader definition of trade. It may very well be that exports and imports are not the right way to think about trade and data. There's a wonderful paper from the McKinsey Global Institute about global connectedness. They talk about connectedness in data, goods, services, finance, and people, and they sort of put it all in the same framework. I think that by moving to thinking about connectedness rather than imports and exports, you can actually get a lot more popular support. Because we think about exports good, imports bad. It's really not clear in the case of data that that's true. I think part of the problem in Europe when they think about the cross-border data flows is that they actually, we at PPI have spent a lot of time in Europe talking to people. Basically, Europe is benefiting from a lot of the connectivity to the rest of the world, more than the rest of the world is benefiting from the connectivity to Europe. So I think we have to have a change in language before we can actually get the right policy.
Anupam, you've written a lot about your concerns about the future of digital trade and things that can disrupt it and their effects. And I don't know if it's your most recent paper, but certainly a recent paper was on the effects of data localization laws. Could you tell us a little bit about that, things that you worry about and what your paper focused on?
Sure. So the internet, of course, wasn't built with governments in mind at all. When Steve Crocker and Vint Cerf and then the World Wide Web came with Tim Berners-Lee, governments were ignored. And of course, governments have a way of not being ignored. And so we saw kind of what I describe as a first generation of internet border controls being established, which are efforts to stop information from coming in. Think Chinese censorship, or think Yahoo, a Nazi memorabilia not being allowed to come into France. So those are relatively narrow in scope, largely. They were limited, they were targeted to certain kinds of materials. Now what I think is happening, without us even really recognizing it, is a second level of internet border controls. And these are controls on the outflow of information going out of a country, and preventing information from going out of a country. And so this is largely in the service of things like data protection. We can only safeguard data of our citizens if the information is held close. That's the argument. Another argument is we can only effectively govern our citizens, enforce our laws, if the data is held within the country. And so those arguments have been used now to stop data from leaving the country. And these are data localization measures across the world. And this includes, so if you, I and a co-author did a survey of these laws around more than 15 jurisdictions around the world, beginning from Australia to Vietnam. And so in Australia, you have rules that prevent personally identifiable health information from leaving the shores, right? And so these constrain the uses of foreign health services very substantially. In Vietnam, you have requirements that you mirror data within the country for government surveillance and law enforcement purposes. So these are new kinds of data localization measures that you're seeing across the world in liberal countries and illiberal countries. So this isn't just a problem of the Chinas and Irans of the world alone. And as I said, there are good reasons to worry about data flowing across the world, things like data security, data privacy. But what we argue in the paper is that often data protection becomes data protectionism. And so it's used to mask kind of economic motives that are designed to promote local enterprise. And let me give you an example. In Germany, this last year, and I'm sorry the gentleman from Deutsche Telekom isn't here because I would have said this directly with him in the audience. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. So
Go ahead,
last
say it.
year, as you're well aware, so this Reinhard, I did not know that you're from Deutsche Telekom. So okay. Okay. So okay, got it. Sorry,
the lightsaber?
there's some confusion on the in my reading of the panel's description. As Reinhard well knows, Deutsche Telekom's one of Deutsche Telekom's leaders at the time proposed national routing of information. So if you were a German communicating with a fellow German, the information should be, the proposal was, routed only within Germany. It shouldn't cross over, especially into the United States or perhaps into the UK. People assumed that was the fears. And then it has been it's mutated into a Schengen zone routing proposal so that we keep everything within continental Europe, keep it out of the UK and the United States, the Five Eyes countries, and keep it within the continent which we trust more. The fact that this proposal originated with Deutsche Telekom, which stands to be the biggest beneficiary of this proposal, suggests the protectionist impulse at work here. And so I think this is something to be concerned about. So I think I'll leave it at that, but just to conclude, I think there are a lot of important reasons to be worried about data protection, and just to affirm something that Reinhard said earlier on the earlier panel, I do think the United States has been very weak, especially given the Snowden revelations, in protecting data of Americans, but especially in protecting data of foreigners. And so we have to be cautious that when the USA Freedom Act is enacted, the final version doesn't neglect the freedoms of foreigners and the privacy of foreigners, which earlier versions of the statute were largely focused on protecting Americans from the data surveillance regime. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to exchanges with Reinhard.
Let me ask a couple of questions before we leave it at that. Actually, I mean, you mentioned Snowden and the NSA. How much of these sort of data localization laws and these threats are a result of what the NSA is doing, and how much of it are countries using it as an excuse for things they wanted to do anyway? And the second, before you go, the second one was, countries will provide certain, they'll say there are certain benefits of these laws, like you said, protecting patient confidentiality, for example, here, privacy issues, pretty much. But at least in your paper, you argued that that's really not necessarily even so, that what are supposedly the benefits may not even be the benefits.
Absolutely. So I think, in fact, that we think about international trade generally. We could have had a world where we said, we only trust food grown in this country. But we've come to a world where we have international trade in food. And so we buy food from Canada and we buy food from Mexico. And so what we have established are regimes that try to ensure that the quality of food produced wherever it's sourced is adequate, is up to our standards. And that's exactly what we should demand with respect to data. We should demand that privacy and security are respected wherever our data is stored. And the Europeans have a right to demand that of Americans, and we as well of everyone else. So I think that we have, there are important reasons to think that data flow across borders is not itself the problem, but rather the way data is treated in different countries around the world, that's the problem. The way that any particular company uses the information. Let me give you an example. In 2004, so this is a concern that's been not just post-Snowden, but it's been going on for a long time. In 2004, the province of British Columbia was considering outsourcing IT services, largely to American companies like IBM and EDS. So what did the British Columbia Government Employees Union do? They did a study that said data was insecure in the United States. This is 2004, mind you. And they cited the USA Patriot Act at the time. And so they said the US government had too much access to this data. And so the province then turned around and passed a statute that prohibited the transfer of personally identifiable information about Canadians held by public government offices in British Columbia from being transferred outside Canada without the consent of the data subject. The response to that, I think, is it should be that there's no reason to think that data held by IBM south of the border is by itself less secure than data held on a government computer in British Columbia. And so it has to be a risk analysis of the particular situation. And in fact, greater competition in service providers is likely to lead to better security and better privacy for citizens around the world. And so I think there are important reasons to think that stopping data at national borders is not the way to promote security and privacy and all the other noble objectives that people often cite to do so.
Thanks. Josh, you've done a lot of work on trade issues broadly in addition to digital trade. And we heard a little bit about the TTIP and TISA in the last panel. So how do these digital trade issues fit into the broader trade debates? And are they, do they loom large now in these debates, or do people still consider them kind of secondary issues?
Thanks. So before I actually answer that question, I just think it might be useful to just build a little bit on what fellow panelists have been saying in terms of how do we think about data and trade, because I think it helps understand how trade policy has sought to come at the issue. Because Scott, you actually mentioned in the introduction the importance and growing important role of services, and I think it's just worth emphasising that here, because when we're talking about the trade and data intersection, where there's multiple levels to it, and Mark, you picked this apart very effectively in your presentation. Part of it is very much in services. So, increasingly what we're seeing is that a lot of services can be provided online, and there's been some work trying to classify which types of services can be provided online. And there's a lack of data around that. But there's some pretty good estimates out there. So in many respects, when we just think about whether you're providing a consulting service, a legal service, a medical services, the list is actually quite endless and very sort of innovative when you actually look at it. A lot of stuff is now available to be provided online, and that essentially requires internet access and free movement of data across borders. So there's sort of a very direct link there. The other bit is goods, of course. There's sort of a complex debate at the moment about, firstly, whether, for instance, if you download what is traditionally considered a good, like a movie or a CD, whether that is still a good or a service, certainly from a trade law perspective. But wherever you come out on that debate, certainly we can sort of see how you can download a whole lot of products now online, and additionally you can sort of basically obviously use the internet to research, find information, shop, even if you end up actually receiving the physical good in person. But there's still an important role for cross-border data flows in that space as well. The financial services bit has been mentioned, and that's a very important part of the financial services sector, the ability to move data globally. And then there are other bits of it which are sort of indirectly related to trade. So businesses move data amongst themselves in enormous quantities in very important ways. From everything from HR data through to managing supply chains globally requires the free movement of data globally. And even if you take it down a level, when you think about the type of information that is on the internet. There's some great work actually that Meredith, the ITC's done on the importance of internet access for SMEs, and in fact identifying essentially sort of market information as one of the key barriers to why SMEs don't engage in international trade. So now you can basically get online and find out information about a foreign market and all the regulations that need to be complied with. And it's a key sort of stepping stone towards allowing a lot of businesses that would otherwise find it too costly to export to actually now become traders. So there's a lot of sort of angles here where internet access, cross-border data flow is international trade in a very direct sense, or is actually enabling international trade. Now, from a trade policy perspective, like where has certainly the US come at this from? The USTR is very seized of this as an important issue, and so in a sense, the argument I think within the United States has been fairly effectively made that this should be made a priority and a goal in trade negotiations. And we see that, if you take a step back and you look at the WTO, which was negotiated and finalised over the course of the 80s and the early 90s, when the internet was, largely, being developed, and certainly the potential and opportunities with regards to its impact on international trade were not known at the time. The rules there are inadequate in many different respects, but there is actually some really interesting and useful language for the financial services sector on data flows, and it kind of, that's where it's more or less it ends. I mean, there's legal arguments about the extent there are implicit commitments on data flows in the WTO, but we don't have to discuss that here today. Going forward, the next kind of big leap really was probably in the most recent free trade agreement the United States did with South Korea, where there's essentially a commitment to the free flow of data. It's not what one would call sort of binding in the sense that it's a requirement, it's more auditory, but it's there and subject to a whole range of sort of exceptions for legitimate sort of policy reasons. And so the next really big step is this range of new free trade agreements which are being negotiated at the moment. Probably the most significant in terms of size and most likely to be concluded first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, which is a 12-nation negotiation being led by the United States, but includes Japan, the NAFTA countries from South American countries from around the Asia-Pacific region, including, for instance, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Australia. And there, certainly, USTR is pushing very hard to get some stronger commitments on cross-border data flows. And so this will be sort of, I think, the first time we're going to see the extent that the US has been sort of successful in building on what's been done so far. And then the other opportunities that are out there, certainly the transatlantic negotiations, which are going to sort of raise a whole bunch of different issues to the ones that are coming up in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, to the extent that I think that we would expect that the Europeans to be more or less on the same page in terms of appreciating the importance of free flow of data. But the privacy issue in that negotiation is going to loom very significantly. Anupam's talked about the European approach to privacy, which essentially, when it comes to data flows, basically says if you don't have the same privacy regime as us, data flows aren't allowed to go. Your personal data is not allowed to basically transfer to that country. And so how that gets worked through is going to be an issue, and it brings in discussions that are going on now under the US-EU Safe Harbour framework, and to the extent those are successful, and there's a debate about how, whether or not you want to reflect any of that into a trade negotiation at all. And then there's the TISA negotiations you mentioned, Scott, which is a services-focused negotiation. I don't recall off the top of my head how many parties are participating, but it's in the 30s, I think, and it's essential. And the interesting thing with these negotiations is that China's very keen to join this negotiation, and we've touched on, I think, some of the challenges China presents for cross-border data flows, both from sort of a broad censorship perspective that China applies to the internet, but also I think it's fairly clear when it comes to China that a lot of their data flow protection has, as Anupam, I think, very accurately pointed out, been motivated clearly by sort of very typical sort of protectionist motivations. I mean, when you redirect internet searches from Google to Baidu, or you block access to Facebook because you want to promote your local equivalent, it's fairly clear what the motivation is there. So bringing them into that negotiation to the extent that you can actually have a discussion in that space about data flows, I think is potentially also interesting and useful.
So let me ask, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, so tell me if I'm wrong, that through the long history of trade, it's always been about lowering trade barriers, and we've sort of successfully reduced tariffs and trade barriers. And so we started from a bad place, and it's progressively gotten better. But with digital trade, we started from a completely open flow of data, and now we're just working on trying to keep it from getting worse. And if that's the case, that doesn't bode well, right? Because all we're doing is fighting a rearguard action, right? Is that true? Is that a correct characterization, do you think? Or is that too pessimistic?
I actually do think that's a pretty good characterization of where we're at. So whether we're in a better off starting with an open system and trying to maintain it rather than build an open system from a closed system, I think is arguable. But as I said before, I think what's going to be really important here is, as I said, I think the argument's been understood and made in the United States. And so really the key challenge here is making the argument outside of the United States. And part of that is, firstly, convincing, and because this is the case, but convincing regulators and governments and the stakeholder groups in these other countries that care about this issue, whether it's their own IT sector or NGO communities, that this matters to them as well. It's not just a US IT company kind of demand, right? I think the framing of this issue as that is going to be very difficult for the United States to sell globally. The idea that the internet can affect, broad segments of the economy. I mean, this is not about, having your own search engine. It's about the types of, it's about the internet really. I mean, if you look at as a platform for, all manner of businesses to be more competitive and to become kind of essentially global and to become traders. And this is, whether it's in an IT sector or a traditional manufacturing sector. I mean, the idea that there's an IT sort of e-commerce, internet-enabled sector, and one that isn't, I think, is increasingly not the case. I mean, every company today uses the internet, uses email, and relies on it in very different ways. So the impact on restriction of cross-border data flow for economies broadly is going to be significant. So the challenge really is just making that case to the people in other countries that care about it. And I think if that can be done successfully, then I think we stand a good chance of building the rules to make sure that the system remains open.
Thanks. Matt, so Facebook, obviously a company that has a lot at stake here, over 1 billion active members, I think all of whom want to play Candy Crush with me. So you have to deal with these issues every day, and so you see the potential consequences of it. So tell us about some of the pressures that you may face from governments in terms of where they want you to keep their data, and things that affect your investments and where you take the business.
Thanks, Scott. So our mission at Facebook is to make the world more open and connected, and I think, as you can glean from that, at the core of our mission is the idea that you have to be able to share information freely across borders. We literally can't connect the world if there are barriers to connecting people. And so I think the barriers that have been mentioned on this panel, censorship of information, requiring storage of data in particular markets. One issue that I think hasn't been touched on, but that Joshua has written about in his work, is internet access. You can't actually can't connect. You can't have a trade economy and digital services if you don't have access to the internet. All of those are core barriers to us achieving our mission. I was actually thinking, when I was reading the work of my fellow panelists in preparation for the panel, I was actually anticipating that it was possible that this was going to be an incredibly boring panel, because it seemed like we all basically agree internet trade is important. The barriers to internet trade are problematic. We should do what we can to combat those barriers. And so I was sort of thinking then, well, if we all agree, then this should be an easy problem. And from our position where we sit as a company, we should look around the world and we should see these barriers decreasing. I think, Scott, as you alluded to in your question with Joshua, I think the opposite is actually the case. I think when we look around, we see the barriers increasing. We see increasing pressure on censorship. We see increasing pressure around forced localization. Internet access is obviously an incredibly compelling and challenging problem. And so why, if there's so much consensus, like I don't think you see people jumping up and down and saying protectionism is a wonderful thing, if there's so much consensus, then why are we seeing, sort of empirically, why are we seeing barriers on the rise? And I think actually the work of all the folks on this panel provide some answers to that. So I think one is it's challenging to quantify value. So the work that Mike Mandel has done, I think, provides really compelling evidence that that's the case. I think another potential answer is that people actually haven't experienced the value of trade in digital services. And so that's something we're currently actually quite focused on now at Facebook. So about a year ago, Mark Zuckerberg announced an initiative called Internet.org, which is focused on bringing the next 4.5 billion people online. And that's really targeting the idea that if more and more people can experience the value of internet, that will be a good thing. So a couple of weeks ago, we launched an initiative in Zambia that is a set of free basic services that people can access for free. And so that's social network services like Facebook, messaging services, but also Google Search, women's health information, job boards, weather information for farmers, and we're hoping that that will stimulate demand within Zambia for internet consumption that I hope will eventually lead to barriers to trade and digital services falling as opposed to rising. So that's the work that we're focused on as a company.
Within Facebook, I don't know whether you can answer this or not, but where does it rate in terms of issues that you think about? I mean, do you struggle to get people to think about why this matters, or is it really at the forefront?
No, I think it's really at the forefront. I mean, I think maybe not necessarily trade qua trade. Like, I don't know if it's not that we are in 6 hours of meetings a day talking about TPP necessarily, although it's certainly an important issue for us. Yeah, but the meetings that we are in for more than 6 hours a day, unfortunately, are meetings about censorship issues, meetings about forced localization, and so all the sort of subcomponents that are a part of the trade conversation are front and center for us. I mean, I think that the idea that we are a mission-driven company may seem like an abstraction for people sitting outside the company, but we say the phrase, our mission is to make the world more open and connected, multiple times a day, and we look at the things that stand in the way of that mission, and a lot of the barriers that we've talked about today directly stand in the way.
Before I keep asking questions, do any of you want to respond to anybody else or ask someone else questions, because you're certainly free? Yeah.
I mean, one point I think that you made, which is it is sort of intimidating to look at some of the difficulty that we have in coming up with agreed principles in this area. In the old days, the trade regime was negotiating down high tariff barriers, and that was pretty easy to quantify. But I think there's a whole nother side of the trade world that has a structure there that can be built on, that can solve a lot of these issues. I mean, the fundamental principles of the trading system, non-discrimination, most favored nation, where you treat everyone the same, trying to avoid measures that are protectionist and hidden restrictions to benefit domestic players. All of these principles have happened in the traditional trade world and stand as a good framework on which to build new disciplines that would be potentially more responsive to what the challenges that our new, very globally successful companies are experiencing. And I think you look at where trade is going, it's going to focusing on measures that help small business, that help development, that help poor countries become more competitive and involved in the global economy. All of this is supported by good disciplines on trade restrictions and open and connectedness. So there's a lot of connections here and overlap that could be built upon using our traditional trade policy tools that we've used over the years.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So, I mean, that we have this existing framework, so we don't have to worry about building something up from scratch, and we don't worry so much about the internet governance issues.
There's things to build on, but there's a lot of building to do.
So that's what I was going to ask. I mean, do you think that the existing institutions we have for trade are can deal effectively with this new kind of trade, or what has to change?
Well, I think there's opportunity in the WTO. Josh did a great rendition of all the different places that we're negotiating these issues. But to my mind, and this is more of a political comment that I shouldn't make, but I'm sort of a recovering Capitol Hill staffer. You need trade negotiating authority. You need the U.S. Political system to be bought into being actively involved and at the table, at the negotiation with the authority to make trade-offs and get to deals. We're not going to be able to do it by no negotiating authority. Well, I don't guess that's too blanket of a statement, but we need to be engaged and move it up on the priority list if we want to accomplish some disciplines.
Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted the chairman mentioned before, this fits right in with what you're saying. The chairman mentioned before the two studies that the ITC is working on. The ITC is really taking a leadership role in laying out some of the paths for dealing with digital trade. Absolutely essential at this point, because it sort of fits right into what you're saying about the new how you build on the existing structures, making the bridge between the existing structures and where we need to go next.
Yeah,
So I want to build on that. I think the ITC and the USTR are doing a very good job of promoting open and free internet across the world. But we can also do something else, which is to work at home. And that may be, in some sense, easier. So there's a case involving a subpoena for Microsoft in the United States, where a federal prosecutor is asking, many of you are familiar with this, a federal prosecutor is asking information held on a Microsoft server in Ireland. And so Microsoft is being forced to get this information from Ireland, presumably about people abroad, to an American prosecutor. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes foreigners nervous when dealing with American corporations. Does it mean that this was what they cited in 2004 in the British Columbia case? American prosecutors and American government, surveilling the world through the lens of American IT companies. And that's a tremendously dangerous world to live in. And none of these companies want to play that role, but they could be forced to play that role by bad US law. And so we need to make sure that our law is actually protecting people across the world. And here, Reinhard and I will find common ground, I'm sure. And so we need to make sure that if you want information from Ireland, there should be a good process, a robust process that transfers it, but protects the civil liberties along the way and provides due process for actors along the way. And that should occur if the information is sitting in the United States, it's sitting in Ireland, it's sitting in Mexico, it's sitting wherever. We should have proper processes for transferring the information for law enforcement purposes, consistent with civil liberties across the world.
I'll call for questions in just a minute, but let me put both Matt and Anupam on the spot. So Matt, one of Facebook's challenge, well, Facebook believes it's important to get more people around the globe connected, and that's clearly an important goal for lots of reasons. But you also seem to believe that necessarily means that there'd be less push for sort of national laws that might disrupt the free flow of data. But I'm not sure why I see that's necessarily true. I mean, a lot of these barriers are in Europe, where perfect, complete penetration. Why would governments suddenly become less interested in it just because more of their population is connected? I believe connecting the population is the right thing to do, but based on Anupam's work, I'm not sure why I see that necessarily leads to more openness.
Yeah. Well, so I think barriers do necessarily lead to less openness, and so I think, like in Europe, for instance, we would like to see fewer barriers, not more barriers.
But they have these barriers even though the entire continent is connected.
Right, exactly. So I guess it's not the same that they're like coextensive. That the presence of barriers means that you can't connect, but it certainly is not helpful. I think sort of by definition it's not helpful. And so I think it's not that we're opposed to sort of any national laws, it's that we're opposed to things that get in the way of connecting people. And I think when you look at forced localization proposals, for instance, I think that is clearly a barrier to making the world more open and connected. I think censorship clearly is a barrier to making the world more open and connected.
Right. I guess I'm asking something different, though. I mean, maybe it's just a dumb question, but as governments have more at stake with their population online, why do you think that necessarily means that the governments will be more interested in the free flow of information as opposed to making it more difficult for their citizens to connect globally? Mike, you were going to answer that. I mean, just tell me if it's a stupid question.
No, it's not a stupid question, but I think you're doing it sort of binary. If you look at the amount of data usage in Europe per capita, and this is based on Cisco's figures that were recently revised, it's much, much lower than in the US, both for consumer information and for business data. And so basically, these are countries which are less involved with the internet than we are, okay? And there may be chunks of SMEs in Germany, for example, that don't rely on it in the same way here. So if you think about connectedness as a range as opposed to a binary, Europe actually still has, Europe as a whole still has a way to go. And each country has a different story, but there's substantial differences between the US and many European countries and Europe as a whole.
Right. Well, then, I mean, that also just sort of suggests the causality is different, right? That it's not that you get more people connected and barriers fall. It's that as you can make barriers fall, it creates further incentives for people to connect, right?
Yeah, and I think a fully connected population doesn't necessarily mean that you're realizing the full economic value of those connections. And so I think the fewer barriers there are, the more that you can realize that value. I think it's definitely the case it is clearly the case that governments see the internet as a place where they can derive value. And I think there's an open question about exactly what that value is. I think one of the main concerns for us is that governments will see the value as being able to constrain access to information and limit what their populations can access, get access to user data to use for law enforcement proceedings. I think we hope that the trend will move in a very different direction where governments are seeing a different opportunity to get value from the internet. So one quick example, the Rwandan IT minister has told stories about how he has discussions with his finance minister about how to extract value from the internet. And his finance minister basically says, we want to tax the crap out of the internet. And the IT minister says, I can help you to get to your objective of 8% GDP growth, and I know a way to get there that is not taxing the internet sector. It's actually reducing barriers to connectivity within Rwanda, and there's evidence, lots of evidence that shows that reducing barriers to connectivity will increase GDP growth. So I can get you to your GDP target, and I can get you there by not taxing this sector.
Questions? Yeah, Reinhard.
Thanks, Anupam, for raising the question of and addressing the question of the so-called Schengen routing or Internet of the short ways, as it is being discussed. Just in explanation, and to give you some more background, and then I have a question towards you. The reason for this and the motives for this kind of ideas or consideration, and yes, Deutsche Telekom has been blamed in the USTR report for this. As a potential trade violation. And I think the first motivation about this was national security interest. National security interest after German citizens' data have been collected, after the Snowden revelations, after the data have been collected, and after the Chancellor's phone has been spied out. So the first motivation was national security interest. And I think the question of how are national security interests addressed in this kind of the internet governance and so forth is a core issue of the question of safe harbor and so forth is still open to question. But Germany is not the only country which is interested in national security interests. Secondly, our customers were extremely concerned, business customers and individuals, about their data being collected by foreign agencies without knowing what foreign agencies would do with that kind of data. So we're kind of suspicious about that. So yes, they approached German companies, not only Deutsche Telekom, they approached them. The same happened in France and some other member states. The person said, what can you offer? Can you offer us a secure cloud? And yes, that's a cloud was being branded cloud made in Germany, cloud made in Europe. So I think there is, that's exactly, well, in the direction what I meant. Let's make the discussion too emotional. And I think if we brand the natural interest of a country and its citizens as protectionism, it's something like making the victim responsible. So now my question to you. You mentioned a couple of countries which restrict the free flow of data. You mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned Australia, you mentioned Germany. There's one country you did not mention. You did not mention the United States of America. So I'm sure you're aware that there are certain rules on companies, like mobile companies in this country, which are owned by foreign countries, which are owned by foreign entities. And these involve procedures of the CFIUS, and these involve, in the case of telecommunications, the institutions of so-called Team Telecom. I'm sure you're aware of that. I'm not sure that you're aware of that, and I don't know whether you covered that in your report, is that these agencies require agreements, so-called agreements, national security agreements, with these foreign-owned entities on the question how data is localized, on the question how data is routed. It's a national local routing requirements in these national security agreements, and how the data is stored. So my question is, have you covered this in your report as well?
So
Wonderful. Thank you so much for terrific questions. So before I turn to your question, let me address some of your observations. So you pointed out that some of your clients have come to you, some presumably German or French companies have come to you and said, we're concerned about the United States spying on us, and that's a really serious and valuable issue. I'm concerned about the United States spying on me. So I think we should all be up in arms about it. And so I think that's a very serious issue. And I appreciate the concern. And your response, I think an appropriate response, is to say, we can offer you email made in Germany. We can offer you a cloud made in Germany. And that's great. That's exactly what I'm proposing. You offer whatever services you think your customers will value. The question is whether German companies could use outside vendors, non-Schengen zone vendors, non-German vendors, to provide security if they thought that was a better solution to provide security, or for whatever other reasons, right? So the question is whether you need a government mandate to achieve the security that your customers want. I don't believe you need a government mandate to do that. And so that is, I think, ultimately undermines security and privacy. It reduces competition. We know from the history of protectionism that the local incumbent doesn't, in the long run, offer as good services as someone who is subject to global competition. That's the history of international trade. And so over the long run, having only a local monopolist or a few local providers not subject, whose markets are insulated by government mandates doesn't bode well for security. You point out a very serious issue about the United States. And you already heard me complain about the United States, and we can complain some more and use this stage to do so. So I was unaware of this when I wrote the first version of this report, but of this paper. The final published paper will include all the CFIUS documents I've come across. I gave a talk. I had a debate on this issue in Berlin, where someone kindly pointed out these issues to me, just in May. And so as it turns out, the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, has, from time to time over the last decade, a decade and a few years actually, when faced with proposed investment in a telecom company, sometimes asked for localization requirements for communications. Now, the one with Deutsche Telekom is actually not very demanding. It simply says there should be no other than a commercial reason for transiting data outside the country. That doesn't seem to be alarming, but there's one with investment into Puerto Rico Telecom, which is straightforward national routing at its worst. And so the CFIUS committee, acting in its own protectionist way, has been doing this in the United States, unbeknownst to scholars like me, at least, and I think even to many IT companies. So this is a problem. The CFIUS committee operates entirely in back doors, and it hasn't had the kind of the opening, the transparency that we need, and the criticism that we need. And my final report will certainly criticize the CFIUS committee for doing these kinds of localizations from time to time.
Also, I don't think your basic points wasn't really relevant. Which countries caused the problems? Although the U.S. did cause a lot of them. I mean, Germany likes to listen to our secretaries of state, and so I don't think any particular government is a good example of it. Although ours is a pretty terrible one. Sorry, yeah.
I just want to make a brief, additional comment, because I think it's an important point that's been raised. I just want to talk about this very briefly, generally. I mean, I think, in this post-Snowden world, we're having, I think, a very important discussion about the overlay between national security and how the internet essentially works. And your observation, Scott, I mean, every country, if they have the capacity, is using the internet to collect data on people. And, the United States does it, Germany does it, and, multiple countries do it. I mean, with the Financial Times reported yesterday that Germany's been spying on, high-level Turkish officials for many, many, many years, including the leader. So, what's the solution here, right? I mean, the concern, I think, is that we go down this path where everyone responds, and this is sort of like the approach that Brazil floated, where you sort of start creating your own internets, right, under the guise of this is what we need to do from a national security perspective. And so certainly, if you follow that debate to its logical conclusion, you start looking at a balkanised internet. And so, I just point this out because I think that we're in a space where we have to recognise that this is just not a United States use of the internet. I mean, there are certainly domestic issues in terms of collection of data, etc., and the use of private companies for those purposes, and that's an issue. But when you look at this issue globally, everyone's doing it, and I think it's important that everyone recognise that. And then there needs to be a debate about how do you manage this issue without going down this path of everyone creating their own internets.
I think we have a question right over there.
Thank you. Alan Rawls, Sidley Austin. Professor Chandler mentioned the case in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan involving the search warrant that Microsoft received for data in Ireland, and Microsoft resisted that search warrant on the grounds that it was an extraterritorial application of U.S. search warrant law, which wasn't permitted. And other tech companies supported Microsoft in that effort. I submitted a brief for AT&T in that case. Verizon submitted a brief, Apple and Cisco. So it's interesting that U.S. communications companies, tech companies, very much see this as a business issue, a trade issue. And my question really is there any public policy effort to persuade the U.S. government, Department of Justice, this was a law enforcement, not a national security matter, to recognize that overall U.S. interests may be served by a more circumspect application of these of requests for information that may have an extraterritorial impact. The president has, in I think it's Presidential Decision Directive 28 recently, he did impose some additional protections for foreign citizens in the national security context. But it's fair to say that the courts are not giving a lot of credence or a lot of weight to the trade implications for U.S. tech companies of these decisions. The Department of Justice is not doing so. So is there a public policy effort to persuade the U.S. government at a more broad-based level than the Department of Justice to be more reserved so that U.S. internet and technology and business interests are not inhibited?
I think that's a very important point, and thank you for submitting a brief in the case. So the case is really important because it's even worse than data localization in some sense, right? The implications. The implication is that you don't want Google to build out a cloud in Europe because you can no longer trust that Google's cloud in Europe is secure from US authorities in the United States. So it's not even data localization. It's actually a flat-out prohibition on using US data services. Right? So the fact that Google and Facebook have their servers in Ireland or Denmark, et cetera, is not enough under this theory if this theory survives. Right? So it's a real. That's the reason why these companies have been very active in fighting this subpoena. And in fact, if you look at American Supreme Court, I think the argument that you've made, I'm certainly about the. In cases like Morrison and Kilble, the U.S. Supreme Court has been very reluctant to apply U.S. law extraterritorially, especially recently in the last handful of years. And so to apply the Stored Communications Act extraterritorially seems to fly in the face of this precedent. So there's possibility that at the Second Circuit there might be a reversal. I'm sure you're working on that, but. As far as whether this issue has risen to the level of a concerted effort, certainly the EFF is complaining vociferously, but I haven't really seen that much activism around it. But it's a real menace to American companies.
let me add one more thing here, which is you can look at the economic angle, which is how much economic damage would this do? And not just to companies, but to the US economy. And right now we actually, maybe when the ITC's next report comes out, we'll sort of know more. But we're sort of building towards the data stream that we need to have in order to sort of say, yes, this would have this much economic impact. Right now, estimates are too low because you're not picking up all the cross-border data flows, because a lot of the ones that we would lose are actually ones that are not being measured right now.
There's a question right there. Yeah. And I think, Tom, do we have time for one more after this? Do you think? Okay, Baron's been remarkably quiet. So.
Hi, Ed Hurst at BlackBerry. This is an excellent panel. Thank you very much. And just wanted to play off one of Scott's questions earlier about where laws might be appropriate and not. And Meredith made a really excellent point to start it off talking about the Big Five and how that influenced things. And Michael and Josh talked about some of the uses aside from what those Big Five are doing, perhaps. But what I see coming from Silicon Valley is a lot of the new companies using the internet are not necessarily consumer-based like the Big Five, but are business software companies. We hear about the cloud, and some of it is, of course, the consumer companies, but there's companies like Salesforce and Workday and Splunk and a variety of others that are all focused on different aspects of business over the web. Now SAP, Oracle are in it. People focus on the enterprise. And I'm wondering are we ignoring that too much, which in some ways, in terms of revenue, is a bigger part of the economy and where the US is going to be competitive in the long term. And that's where a lot more potentially revolutionizing aspect of the internet is for commerce. And will those kind of companies get swept up in all the concerns about censorship, which is not really an issue for them, it's not really used for political purposes, or about NSA spying, whatever? Again, they're not doing that. So I'm wondering, is there a danger that because we focus on these issues that get so much PR, we're going to damage the possibility of all these other areas because these other areas will just get swept in by it? So going to Scott's point is, should we say, some laws are okay as long as it preserves the ability to these larger areas of business?
I mean, I think there is a danger that they do get damaged if we don't have, take into account some of these different interests. And I think, a discussion on the Hill or in the administration about balancing some of the business software concerns is important. I think you saw the Business Software Alliance, if I can remember, seems to be upping their priority a bit more on free data flows against forced localization. IP is still a big concern, but it's probably not their number one concern in terms of trade agreements. So, I mean, all of those economic concerns, I think, need to be factored in here, and that's what you get when you get a debate on forward-looking trade policy.
The ability to move data cross borders is very important for all the companies that you mentioned. Unfortunately, privacy ends up affecting them as well, especially if it's applied more intensively. And so we see a really big danger in this, not just affecting the services that are out there, but the ones that could be created going forward. It impinges very badly on innovation, but let's actually make a sort of slightly broader point here. So if you think about this in terms of ordinary trade protectionism, you end up saying that it's when you're building up barriers, it's the countries that build the barriers that end up suffering more than the ones that don't. And you'll start seeing a divergence in growth rates from this that may turn out to be quite important over the long run.
No, I think it's a great question because, and I'm remiss if I didn't talk about it before. I mean, the business-to-business part is really important and growing here. And I was trying to make that point. I think when you look at the capacity for businesses of all sizes, and I think the startup world is a great example to use the internet to essentially access the most competitive, sort of cutting-edge inputs essentially into their businesses, which increases their productivity and their competitiveness and makes them more successful both domestically and overseas. There's actually a great, there's a bunch of papers, but I mean, there's one I'm thinking of specifically that the OEC has done, which has actually tried to quantify, in fact, the export gain from actually increasing access to a whole lot of online sort of business services. And so, this picks up both the importance of, I think, the ability to access the internet and cross-border data flows for businesses in the United States, certainly, and it also, I think, draws our attention to the potential here for entrepreneurs and businesses outside the United States, developing countries. I mean, one only needs to think of the opportunities that India presents to increasingly provide these type of services using the internet, which provides growth and development opportunities for these countries as much as it improves the productivity and competitiveness of businesses in the developed world. So the question, then, I mean, I think the hard part is really also going to then be, we've talked about a range of potential barriers and restrictions that governments talk about, and what's clear, I think, is that we're not talking about prohibiting them necessarily under the context of new trade rules. I mean, privacy is sort of a key example, because I think this is going to be probably one of the sort of areas where the rubber really does hit the road, and it's going to be trade law and trade policy generally is not in the business of telling governments what's a legitimate policy or not. I mean, there are some which are clearly not legitimate, but generally speaking, trade law is fairly differential, and trade policy to governments making up their own mind about what they need to achieve, how they go about achieving legitimate goals. Really what the disciplines tend to be is, okay, if you want to achieve your privacy goals, if you want to limit access to certain offensive materials because you think it infringes particular values or cultural norms in your own country, fine. But can we go about doing it in a way which is going to be sort of least harmful from an economic and a trade perspective? And so, we're only really at the beginning of having that conversation, because a lot of governments, when they think about privacy, for instance, I think this is absolutely true in the European context, don't think about this from a commercial or a trade perspective. They think about it from a human rights perspective only, and that's fine and it's understandable, but it also ignores that side of the equation. And so, part of what needs to be done is through trade negotiations, but I think also importantly in other forums which are less sort of transactional, whether we're talking about in APEC or on a bilateral basis or elsewhere, is actually building up the conversation about why these barriers, what their economic and commercial implications are, and how do you go about achieving your otherwise legitimate goals in ways that are going to be least harmful from an international trade perspective.
So we're actually over time, but I've been so worried about Baron. He's been so quiet. I'll let ask your. I'd like you to ask your question, and
actually,
we'll
for once,
quickly.
it's a short question. So last year in December, Senators Thune and Wyden, in a rare display of bipartisanship, proposed legislation that would give the USTR authority and specific criteria for negotiating to remove and minimize cross-border data flow barriers in both trade negotiations and in multi-stakeholder processes. I thought that was great. Unfortunately, it hasn't seemed to catch much fire. Comments on the merits of their proposal and why it hasn't caught fire and what could be done to promote those ideas?
I'll tell you my answer why it hasn't caught fire. Because most of what we see as cross-border data flows doesn't get counted in the trade numbers, and so you can't. What happens is our European. The TTIP is focusing on agriculture, for God's sake, okay? And agriculture is the thing we count the best, okay? And so you gravitate to the things you count the best because you can see where the real damage. The fact is, in terms of what privacy restrictions might do, what data protection might do, we don't actually have the data that we need to estimate the real damage. And so I know that we sort of think of Washington as sort of not being driven by numbers, but in some cases it is.
It's sort of a what gets measured gets done.
What gets measured gets done.
Making it more important for us to get the second report from the ITC out.
Absolutely.
So I think probably with that, should wrap it up. Tom, we probably want to come up here and say a few words about conclusion and lunch. But if you could join me in thanking the panel.
Yeah, I'm told that the weather is not great outside, so we've moved lunch indoors to the Aspen room, which is on the first floor by the elevators. So, right? But you didn't.